Agreeableness is a very difficult personality dimension to understand, I think, partly because it's difficult to dissociate from neuroticism and as well from extroversion. Because agreeable people like you, and so that kind of sounds like extroversion, and disagreeable people sound like they're hard to get along with, and they sort of are, but people who are high in neuroticism are hard to get along with too, and they tend to be volatile and irritable. And so most of the time, if you're engaged in a contentious issue with someone and emotions flare, it usually has more to do with trait neuroticism than with disagreeableness per se. So what I'm going to do is try to describe to you what the agreeable trait is on both of its dimensions, also to lay out the pros and cons of existence on that normal distribution, trait normal distribution, at more or less every point. Because I think, the way I look at it anyways, is that of all the traits, agreeableness is the one that seems to come with the most marked positive and negative aspects, features, let's say, so we don't confuse it with aspects, the most positive and negative features at each point on the distribution. It's a very complex, seems to be a very, very complex dimension. So I'll read you some of the questions from the Big Five aspect scale, and that'll give you kind of an initial rule of thumb estimate about whether or not you're agreeable or disagreeable. And so here are some of the questions. Imagine that you're answering these for yourself on a scale from 1 to 5, strongly disagree to strongly agree. So the first question is, am not interested in other people's problems. So if you are interested in other people's problems, that tilts you towards agreeableness, and I believe that's agreeableness is divided into compassion and politeness, which also sound like very positive things, right? Because everyone wants to be compassionate and everyone wants to be polite, and so you might say, well, is that a virtue? Are those virtues, with the other end being actually negative, to be not compassionate, not polite? It's certainly worded that way, and that's actually a mistake, because we know that these traits are normally distributed, roughly speaking, right? And that means that there has to be positive and negative features at every single position on the distribution. And so to make the presupposition, for example, that being extroverted is being better than being introverted, or that being emotionally stable is necessarily better than being neurotic, is to make a confusion of moral obligation with trait position. You have to assume that there's advantages and disadvantages all the way along, or the distribution wouldn't have set itself up that way, especially because these seem to be biologically instantiated traits. So anyways, if you're interested in other people's problems, they like to unburden themselves to you, you care about it. That's a mark of compassion. If you're more or less indifferent to other people's stupid problems and you wish they just get on with it, then you're less compassionate, you're harsher and more, well, at the extreme, more callous. Let's see. Respect authority. That's politeness. That's part of agreeableness. Rarely, let's see. Feel others' emotions. Compassion. Inquire about others' well-being. Compassion. Can't be bothered with others' needs. Take advantage of others. That's disagreeable, obviously. Sympathize with others' feelings. Avoid imposing my will on others. Wait for others to lead the way. Okay, I think all of those were associated with trait agreeableness or disagreeableness. So let's think about this for a minute. So I'm going to tell you how I conceptualize agreeableness. The first thing you want to know is that women are more agreeable than men, about half a standard deviation. And that's approximately enough so that if you took a random male and a random female out of the population and you tried to guess who was more agreeable and you guessed the female, you'd be right about 60% of the time. So, but what's interesting about that, and this is something also to keep in mind, is about normal distributions, you know. So imagine you have a normal distribution so that most people are in the middle, and then you have another normal distribution, male and female, and mostly they overlap. But you see out here and out here, they don't overlap at all. And so even though on average men and women aren't that much different in terms of their levels of agreeableness by the group. If you go out and you look at the extremes, they're very different. So all of the most agreeable people are women, and all of the most disagreeable people are men. And the thing is, the extremes are often what matter, rather than what's in the middle. And so one of the ways that's reflected in society, by the way, is there's way more men in prison. And the best personality predictor of being imprisoned is to be low in agreeableness. It makes you callous. Now, you might think, well, what's the opposite of compassion and politeness? And the answer to that is, I think it's best sort of conceptualized as a trading game. So let's say that we're going to play repeated trading games. And if you're very agreeable, then you're going to bargain harder on my behalf than you're going to bargain on your own behalf. Whereas if you're very disagreeable, you're going to do the reverse. You're going to think, I'm in this trading game for me, and you're going to take care of your own interests. Where an agreeable person is going to say, no, at best, this is, at worst, this has to be 50-50, but I'd like to help you every way I can. Okay, now so you kind of understand that. Now the advantage to being agreeable then is that you're good in teams and you're very much likely to give other people credit. The downside of being agreeable is that you're not very good at putting forward your own interests. And so one of the things that predicts salary across time, for example, is agreeableness, and it predicts it negatively. And so it's part of the reason why women get paid less than men. And this is something for the women in the class to really listen to. Because how you get paid across time depends on a very large number of things, right? It depends on your skills and your abilities and your position and your social network and all of that. But the other thing it depends on is whether or not you actually go ask for money. Or maybe that you don't even ask. Because actually you don't ask for money. You tell people that you need to be paid more or something they don't like will happen. And I don't mean as a threat. I mean that you have to be willing, when you're negotiating, to have an alternative. Go talk to your boss, who isn't going to give you money, because everyone wants money, right? It's a competitive game. You're going to have to go there and say, look, here's what I do. Here's why it's useful. Here's why you have to give me more money. And this is my opportunities if you don't. And then you're not taking your boss's money anyways, because it's very frequently the case that he's working for a whopping big company. But he needs an excuse to give you money, because everyone's asking for money all the time. And so you have to put your case forward powerfully and disagreeably. Now, you don't want to do it too disagreeably, because then he's going to think that you're a son of a bitch, and maybe he's not going to give you anything, and maybe you'll get fired for being mouthy and all of that. And that certainly happens to people who are too disagreeable. You got to get the balance right. But it's definitely the case. And the other thing that happens to women that's also worth noting, and this is probably because they're higher in negative emotion, is they tend to underestimate their own utility in business settings, right? Because if you're trying to evaluate what you're like, and you're more tilted towards negative emotion, then the things that you do that are wrong are going to stand out more on the foreground than the things that you do that are right. So if you go into a negotiation and you're uncertain already, because you have self-doubts, and then you're agreeable in the negotiation, what's going to happen is that you're not going to win as often. And winning in a business setting or in a career development setting means more opportunity for promotion and more revenue generated. Now, the downside of that, of course, is as you climb the business hierarchy is that you also have to take on more responsibility. And that responsibility is sometimes unpleasant as well, especially to people who are agreeable, because you're not necessarily liked if you're in a position of authority. And agreeable people really like to be liked. It's their primary motivator, because they're concerned about the maintenance, I would say, of intimate, positive relationships. That also makes them conflict avoidant.
People exist in a sacrificial relationship to the world. What does that mean? It seems to mean something like human beings are aware of their extended self. You know you're going to be around tomorrow and next week and next month and next year and 5 years from now and 10 years from now. Now it's less certain as you go out, but you do have the sense of yourself as something that stretches across the decades. Okay, and so what that means is that you have to conduct yourself in a manner that isn't merely immediate. You have to conduct yourself in a manner that will work across time. Now, how do people do that? They work. Work is a sacrificial gesture. So you work, by definition, virtually. Work is the sacrifice of the present for the future. I mean, maybe someone can come up with a better definition of work than that, but I don't think so. It's like you put in time and effort right now, even if it's something not what you'd like to be doing at the moment. You put in time and effort because you believe. What the hell does that mean? You believe it'll pay off. Well, is that a contract with the future? Is it a covenant? Because the relationship that the biblical corpus characterizes human striving is covenantal. It's a bargain. The bargain is you make the right sacrifices and they pay off. That's the bargain. Now, you might say, well, that's just part of the social contract, but the biblical corpus insists that it's deeper than that. It's built into the structure of reality itself. And that if you got the sacrifices right, the future would be paradisal. That's a kind of sacrifice right there, is that you're willing to sacrifice your short-term physiological and psychological comfort for a medium to long-term benefit. It's the essence of sacrifice. This is something the atheists don't understand about the biblical narrative, is that the narrative insists that we live in a sacrificial relationship. It's the essence of humanity to live in a sacrificial relationship. It's like, well, is that true or not? Well, as you mature, your relationships are more sacrificial. It's less about what you, in your narrow sense, want right now, and it's more about what's good over the medium to long run, including other people. Well, that's a sacrificial relationship. Now, the covenant, and this is a matter of faith. It's the matter of the deepest faith. Are you willing to act out the proposition that the way to make the world reveal itself to you in its most positive guise is for you to adopt the most appropriate sacrificial relationship? Well, it's a big risk, isn't it? Because you have to give up everything. That's the deal. You give up everything that's low. Everything. Well, that's what the Christian passion is, because the Christian passion is an archetypal story, because Christ is the person who sacrifices everything, thoroughly, 100%. There's no indecision, because you age. Like, you pay for your indecision. It's a decision. It's a decision to avoid, fundamentally. And part of the moral that's embedded in the story of Job and in the Christian passion is that you can master what you'll face. And maybe that's true. I mean, the clinical literature seems to indicate that it's true, because one of the things you do, if you're a competent clinician, is you look at what people are attempting to accomplish, and maybe that needs some retooling, but let's assume that they have a goal in mind that would work, right? You talk it through with them strategically. They have a well laid out vision. Okay, now they're laying out the vision and they encounter impediments that stop them. And maybe they're impediments that make them afraid and paralyze them. And so then what you do is you decompose the impediment until you find a way they can advance that constitutes a genuine advance that they'll actually do. So what you do is you take the problem and you narrow it until they'll face it. Okay, then they face it. Then what happens? They get more competent. That's what happens. And then they get better at facing all problems. So they don't just learn how to deal with that specific problem. They learn a lesson that generalizes across problems. They get braver. When you use exposure therapy, people don't get less afraid, they get braver. And that's way better, because braver moves from situation to situation. Okay, so the question is, if you faced everything that was put in front of you, who would you be? Well, the biblical answer is you'd be a true son of God. That's the biblical answer. It's like, well, do you believe that? Well, it depends on what you mean by believe. Do you have a better bet than facing what's there? Well, you just have to be sensible about it for a moment. It's like, is your theory that you're going to adapt better using falsehood and avoidance? Because that's the contrary theory. You either face it, and you do that predicated on the faith that something in you will respond if you do, or you don't face it. That's it. Those are the options. If you don't face it, that's faith too. That's faith in the notion that avoidance and deception will suffice. There's technically two different forms of reward. There's consummatory reward. That's what an orgasm is. It's consummatory reward. It brings the behavioral and perceptual sequence to a halt. It ends it. Right at the climax, it ends it. But then it's over. That journey is over, right? Then there's the dopaminergic reward, and dopaminergic reward is evidence of advancement towards a goal, right? Okay, so there's a corollary to that. Well, how do you become optimally engaged? Because dopamine facilitates engagement and focus, which is why drugs like amphetamines can be used for kids who are attention deficit disordered. You tap up the dopamine response, they lock on, right? Okay, so they're locking on to a goal-directed pursuit. The problem with amphetamines is that they can lock you on so hard you can't get out of the frame. So like kids on amphetamines will obsess, for example, about cleaning up their closet. They can't switch to the next activity. Okay, dopaminergic reward is reward that's accrued in relationship to a goal. Okay, so what's an implication of that? Well, pursue the highest possible goal. Well, why? Because the kick from advancement is higher. Now, you have to balance that. It can't be, you have to advance, right? Because imagine the reward's got two components. Number one is you're moving towards something valuable. Okay, so you want it to be as valuable as possible. Okay, but you have to be moving. You need something extremely valuable that you can move towards. Okay, so part of the reason that you establish a relationship with God, let's say, is because that's what sets the upper bound to your vision. It's like, I want things to be the best they could be. That's a vision of paradise. Well, that has to be fractionated into, your proximal decisions, but lurking behind that should be this continual movement towards, what would you say, a heaven that recedes as you approach it. That's the proper vision of heaven. A heaven is a place that's perfect and getting better, both at the same time. That's what music shows you, because a great piece of music is perfect, but it's just getting better as it unfolds. And you need that. This is part of the problem with a static utopian vision, something Dostoevsky criticized. If you gave people nothing but consummatory reward, he famously says, so that they can do nothing but sit in tubs of hot water, eat cake, and busy themselves with the continuation of the species, human beings would break that all to hell in a moment just so they have something interesting to do. If you run yourself through a disciplinary process, so you accomplish something, maybe you don't attain the goal you were aiming at, but you accrue a new way of looking at the world and a set of skills. Well, if you just keep doing that, you have multiple ways of looking at the world and more skill. Well, that's your storehouse of treasure. As you walk through life in your normal mode, things will call to you. And if you pursue them, they will take you deep. It doesn't really matter what it is that calls. What matters is that you pursue it, and you pursue it to the depths. And as you pursue it to the depths, you will become transformed. And if you do that without reservation, that will turn you into the person who frees the slaves and opposes the tyrants. And that is how it works. That's the call. And that can happen in any direction, virtually any direction. You just have to pursue it with sufficient faith. It's really something to see how many people are dying for a lack of an encouraging word. They don't get encouragement. And people need so little encouragement. It's just unbelievable. I believe that truth will save the world. I believe that. So you speak truthfully, and you watch what happens, and you take your consequences. You're a net force for good if you want to be. One of the things you do with people who are struggling is you make the simple even simpler, because then they can get a toehold. Like if they're really barely able to move. I had one client, he had a hard life, man. He was like 85. He'd fallen off a ladder and broken his neck, and they had permanently fused it. So he was basically like this. He could hardly move. He was so depressed. He literally couldn't get out of bed. It was awful. And he was in chronic pain because of his broken neck. And so the first thing I did with him was get him to sit up for like 30 seconds. That was it. That's where he had to start, and after I worked with him when he was in the hospital, after 2 weeks, he was walking down the hall and able to sit up and read for, 5 or 6 minutes. And he got out of the hospital. He went home, but he had to start with the simplest possible steps. And hey, man, this is the definition of humility in some ways, is that you start progressing where you can start. You have no relationship. Your family's a mess. You've got no friends. You've got no plan. You've got no job. You use your time outside of work not only badly, but destructively. You have a drug or alcohol habit or some other vice, pornography addiction. You are completely unengaged in the surrounding community. You have no scaffolding whatsoever to support you in your current mode of being, or you move forward. And then as a therapist, well, you do two things. Well, if it's depression per se, well, like I said, there's sometimes a biochemical root, a nutritional root. There's ways that can be addressed. It's probably physiological if you're, at least in part, if you're depressed but you have an okay life. Sometimes it's conceptual. You can turn to dreams sometimes to help people, because dreams contain the seeds of the potential future. And if your person is a real good dreamer and you can analyze dreams, that can be really helpful. But that seems to be only true for more creative people. And for the people who just have a terrible life, it's like, okay, you have a terrible life. Well, let's pick a front. How about you need a friend, like one sort of friend. Do you know how to shake hands and introduce yourself? I'll have the person show me. So let's do it for a sec. So this, hi, I'm Jordan. And people don't know how to do that. And then they can't even get the ball rolling.
For the listener, Jordan just gave me a firm handshake.
Yeah, as opposed to a dead fish. You know, and there's these elementary social skills that hypothetically, if you were well cared for, you learned when you were like 3. And sometimes people I had lots of clients to whom no one ever paid any attention. And they needed like 10,000 hours of attention. And some of that was just listening, because they had 10,000 hours of conversations they never had with anyone. And they were all tangled up in their head. And they had to just, one client in particular, I worked with this person for 15 years. And what she wanted from me was for me just to shut the hell up for 50 minutes. It was very hard for me. And to just tell me what had happened to her. And then what happened at the end of the conversation, then I could discuss a bit with her. And then as we progressed through the years, the amount of time that we spent in discussion increased in proportion in these sessions, until by the time we stopped seeing each other, when my clinical practice collapsed, we were talking about 80% of the time. But she had never been attended to properly, ever. And so she was an uncarved block in the Taoist sense, right? She hadn't been subjected to those flaming swords that separated the wheat from the chaff. And so you can do that in therapy. If you're listening and you're depressed, I would say, if you can't find a therapist, and that's getting harder and harder, because it's actually become illegal to be a therapist now, because you have to agree with your clients, which is a terrible thing to do with them, just like it's terrible just to arbitrarily oppose them. You could do the self-authoring program online, because it helps you write an autobiography. And so if you have memories that are more than 18 months old that bother you when you think them up, part of you is locked inside that. An undeveloped part of you is still trapped in that. That's a metaphorical way of thinking about it. That's why it still has emotional significance. So you can write about your past experiences, but I would say wait for at least 18 months if something bad has happened to you, because otherwise you just hurt yourself again by encountering it. You can bring yourself up to date with an autobiography. There's an analysis of faults and virtues for present authoring, and then there's a guided writing exercise that helps make a future plan. That's young men who do that, who go to college, young men who do that, 90 minutes, just the future authoring, 90 minutes. They're 50% less likely to drop out. That's all it takes. Like, I had clients who were so depressed they literally couldn't get out of bed. So what's their first step? It's like, can you sit up once today? No. Can you prop yourself up on your elbows once today? Like, you scale back the dragon till you find one that's conquerable, that moves you forward. There's a rubric for life. Scale back the dragons till you find one conquerable. And it'll give you a little bit of goal, commensurate with the struggle. But the plus side of that, because you think that, God, that's depressing. You mean I have to start by sitting up? Well, you do if you can't sit up. But the plus side of that is it's the Pareto distribution issue, is that aggregates exponentially increase. And failures do too, by the way. But aggregates exponentially increase. So once you start the ball rolling, it can get zipping along pretty good. This person that I talked about was incapable of sitting with me in a cafe when we first met, just talking, even though I was her therapist. But by the end, she was doing stand-up comedy. So, it took years, but still, most people won't do stand-up comedy. That's quite the bloody achievement. She would read her poetry on stage too. So for someone who was petrified into paralysis by social anxiety and who had to start very small, it was a hell of an accomplishment. We should make a very clear distinction here that often when people are embittered and resentful and feel like they're victims, it's because really awful things have happened to them. Now, not always, but often. And so then the question is, well, if you're in a situation and something really awful is happened to you or has happened to you, then, well, why shouldn't you feel like a victim? And is there a better alternative? And part of what you were trying to lay out in this part of the book is what those better alternatives are. So part of looking for that hero is to find out from someone else's example. In your case, it was your mother, but these other sources that you described, of people who were in a sort of hell, in an undeniable sense, but who chose in a very real way to make it as good as it could possibly be given the circumstances. And so they had to turn to sources of power, let's say, and strength and fortitude and resilience.
So here's what you should have done if you were a Nazi and you wanted to win the war. You should have enslaved the Jews and the Gypsies and had them work, right? You should have had them work for the benefit of the victory. And then if you wanted to, you liquidate them afterwards. That's the logical thing to do if you want to win. And we assume that Hitler wanted to win. But that's not a very intelligent assumption. Why would you assume that? He wasn't exactly a good guy. So why should we assume that he was aiming at the good that he was promoting, even in his own terms, right? The glorious, everlasting Third Reich, right? That'll rule for 1,000 years and be a bastion of civilization and music, because that's the sort of thing he purported to be interested in. Well, so what do you do with the Jews and the Gypsies? Well, round them up, fine. Enslave them, fine. You don't kill them. You certainly don't devote a substantial proportion of your war resources while you're losing to accelerate the rate at which the extermination is taking place. Because that's a bit counterproductive, unless what you're aiming at is the maximum possible mayhem in the shortest period of time. Well, so what happened as the Germans started to lose the war? Did Hitler lose faith in his own ability? No, he believed that the Germans had betrayed him with weakness. And so he was perfectly willing to accelerate the rate at which Germany was losing the war. And so when Hitler and his minions had the choice, here's the choice. You can suspend your unnecessary demolition of people, win the damn war, and then pick it up afterwards. Or while you're losing, you can just accelerate the mayhem, even though it's counterproductive. It's like, what'd they pick? Well, they picked to accelerate the mayhem. And so to me, there's an old psychoanalytic idea. I think this was derived by Jung. If you can't figure out what someone is doing or why, look at the outcome and infer the motivation. If it produces mayhem, perhaps it was aiming at mayhem. Now, you have to use that dictum carefully. If someone's irritating you, maybe it's because you're irritable and you should sort yourself out. But maybe it's because they're actually aiming at irritating you. And that's the actual motivation. So perhaps not, but it's another tool in your analytical armament. So, and so you see, well, and this is the thing about warfare that's so interesting about because you can attribute it to territoriality. You can attribute it to a war for resources. That's what I would say, wretchedly simple-minded economists presume. People fight over scarce resources. It's like, hey, we're a little bit more sophisticated than that. And first of all, what resources are you talking about? The bloody Inuit had nothing. They lived perfectly well. What did they have? Snow and seal blubber. People can live in unbelievably deprived conditions. And so the idea that there are natural resources that we fight over because there's a shortage of them is a pretty oversimplified view of human beings. It's like, well, why do people fight? Well, maybe they fight sometimes for good reasons. But very, very frequently, they fight for bad reasons. And those bad reasons are are personal as well as sociocultural and economic. You know, if you were a Nazi prison guard, for example, whatever pathologies you were carrying around in your destructive little soul, whatever element of Cain was deeply embedded in you, had the opportunity to be manifest fully at every moment of your waking existence, right? You had these people who were completely beholden to you, with no rights whatsoever, to whom you could do whatever your evil little heart determined. Think, well, maybe that was a motivation for putting them there to begin with. And all the cover story about, well, we're trying to build the Third Reich and we're trying to stabilize the state and we're trying to do all these good things. Maybe that's just a cover story for the real motivation, which is nothing but what? The construction of death camps that killed 6 million people. How about that? And the obliteration of 120 million people on the planet, and the leaving of Europe in ruins. Maybe that was the motivation. Or are we going to attribute to Hitler the highest possible motives? Say, no, it's an archetypal manifestation of Cain. Now, he's going to put up a front that says, well, I'm your savior. It's like, well, destructive people think that Cain is their savior. There's a chapter in my book called Don't Let Your Children Do Anything That Makes You Dislike Them. And I'm pretty happy about this chapter, although I suspect it'll be rather controversial. And, you know, it's predicated first on the observation that many people hurt their children physically and psychologically. You know, because everyone gets sentimental about the relationship between parents and children, but that's especially in relationship to themselves, because they think, well, you know, of course I'm going to be a good parent. It's like, it's not so bloody obvious that you're going to be a good parent, you know. And so, and then what I see happening with people who don't know how to discipline their children is that the children run roughshod over them in their, let's call them hierarchical disputes, because children push for position in hierarchy. And they do that behaviorally to sort of feel out the contours of the social structure. So, you know, your kid will act perfectly fine at home, let's say, at the dinner table, but then you take them to a stranger's dinner table and all of a sudden they act out. And you think, what's up with you, you little monster? And what's up is that they're trying to figure out what the power structure is in the new... They don't know this, of course, but they're acting this out. They're trying to figure out if the same rules apply in this new situation as apply in the old situation. And they can't ask that, and they don't even know that they are rules exactly. They're regularities that they've learned. And so they'll test, and then you have to show them that, yeah, it's the same here. It's the same in this situation. But lots of parents are very uneasy with disciplining their children, partly because they believe that if you give a child infinite freedom, that's best for them, and that constraints are inappropriate, which is really just, well, I don't know what to say about that, except it's so untrue that it's very difficult to think of anything that's more untrue than that. But also the thing is if you let your children take advantage of you, if you have an ounce of spine and an ounce of aggression, which you do, especially if you don't admit it, then you will take revenge on your children. You know, so if they have a temper tantrum in a grocery store and embarrass you, which a child who's canny can do quite effectively, you know, because you wouldn't let them have that pack of crayons or a chocolate bar. And then, you know, you tell yourself it's okay, and that you still, you know, that really didn't make you that angry, and it's okay, but you're fuming inside. And then you go home, and half an hour later, maybe the child is doing some interesting little bit of work, maybe artwork or something, or does something good and comes up for a reward. It's like the probability that you're going to reward that child properly under those circumstances is zero. You're going to take the opportunity to take your revenge. And if you don't know that, then you're not much of a parent. And so part of the trick with kids is that if your child is doing something that makes you dislike them, that you have to figure out how to stop them from doing that and teach them how to do it properly. And you have to talk to your wife to make sure that you're not being too much of a monster, you know, and the same with her. But that discipline is partly what enables you to continue to like your child while you love them. And even more than that, you know, parents talk about fostering self-esteem and fostering creativity and all of that in their kids. And I think that's misbegotten. It's shallow for a variety of reasons. First, it's not that easy to foster creativity because it's rare, and self-esteem is a very badly defined concept, and mostly it's been used for harm, not good. What your job is as a parent is to help your child learn from between 2 years old and say 4 years old how to act in the world so that when people encounter them, people smile and are happy they're around.
Because then, I've seen kids who behave badly, and everywhere they go, people wear false smiles. And everywhere they go, people are relieved when they leave. And that means you think about that world from the child's perspective. Everyone's lying, and everyone hates them. That's their world. And then if you have your child, capable of adhering to minimal social requirements, like maybe being able to sit at the table in a civilized manner for an hour and being grateful for being fed, let's say, and knowing how to share and knowing how to pay attention to adults and not having that, that kind of terrible cynicism and arrogance that can develop even in a 4-year-old child who's always had its way, then they'll interact with adults in a manner that bring out the best in the adults. And everywhere they go, everyone smiles at them and pats them on the head, maybe even tells them useful and interesting things. And so the whole world opens up for them. And that's all a consequence of you having enough courage to admit to yourself that your child can do things that you don't like and that you will take it out on them if you don't straighten it out. And people don't like that idea because they think, well, I'd never do anything. I love my child. I'd never do anything to hurt them. It's like, yeah, God, right. You're so asleep if you think that there's almost no hope for you. You have to think, I'm way bigger than this child, and I'm way meaner, and I'm way trickier, and I'm way more unpredictable. And so I better be very careful in my relationships with this child so that the worst of me doesn't come out. And then that gives you enough intelligence to make a disciplinary framework that's minimal and enforce it properly and carefully.
So I wondered what's motivated you, because you push in so many directions simultaneously. You have to be really highly motivated to do that. And so you figured out that the question, in a sense, was the answer.
Yeah, the question, or said another way, that seeking greater enlightenment and a better understanding of the universe and what questions to ask about it is something that we can continue to do as a civilization for
likely forever.
Exactly. So
depending on how powerful Grok turns out to be.
Yeah, so then I thought, okay, I'll work on things that improve our understanding of the universe. I know now that they say, like, at a base level, this is why I actually think we want a population increase, because population increase means that there are more people, that we've expanded the scale.
More brains, man.
Yeah, we've expanded the scale of consciousness to the degree that there are different cultures. We've expanded the scope of consciousness.
How did you cotton on to the fact that antagonistic attitude towards birth that's embedded in our culture now was something that should be called out and that was pathological?
I should perhaps go back to what is the foundation of my philosophy, because that I think helps build up to explain my actions. So when I was, about 11 or 12 years old, I had somewhat of an existential crisis because there just didn't seem to be any meaning in the world. Like, I had no meaning to life. And I actually tried to read all the religious texts.
At that age?
Yes.
Okay.
I was a voracious reader as a kid. I obviously read the Bible, I read the Quran, the Torah, the various, but on the Hindu side, just trying to understand all these things. And obviously as a 12-year-old, you're not really going to understand these things super well. But
you understood it well enough to have an existential crisis when you were 11 or 12.
Yeah, I'm just trying
That's a start.
Does anyone have an answer that makes sense? And then I started getting into the philosophy books, and I read quite a bit of Schopenhauer, Nietzsche, and which is quite depressing to read as a kid.
I'd say that.
That's depressing as an adult, but none of them really seemed to have, to me, answers that resonated, at least to me. But then I read Douglas Adams' Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, which is really a book on philosophy disguised as humor. And the point that Adams tries to make there is that we don't actually know all the answers, obviously. In fact, we don't even know what the right questions are. That's where he has this if you've read the book, the Earth is actually a giant computer to understand the answer to the question, what is the meaning of life?
Yeah.
And comes up with the answer 42.
Yeah.
And people are like, what does that mean? It says, you didn't understand the thing that's going to take a computer far more powerful than Earth is to understand what question to ask. That's simply the wrong question.
So was that the key realization, that the question was the thing?
That was a fundamental turning point, yeah.
Yeah, because that's it. So that's very interesting, because one of the things that you see constantly portrayed in hero myths across the world is that the adventure is the thing and that the search is the thing, rather than there being
a final answer, as absurd as 42 might be, right? The conclusive answer is something like deep engagement in the process. So I'll give you an example of that. So in the Sermon on the Mount's a very detailed set of instructions.
Yeah.
So there's 3 parts to it. The first is aim at the highest thing that you can possibly conceive of and keep modifying that so your aim gets better. Okay, so that's number 1. Number 2 is make the presumption that other people have the same intrinsic value as you do.
You have to be careful about that one.
Okay, let's discuss that. What would you say? It's a recognition of the universalist value of everyone who's made in the image of God. It's something like that. But the third thing is, once you do those 2 things, you can concentrate on the moment. See, and that seems to be, even technically, you can think about this neuropsychologically. If you're looking for meaning is a form of incentive reward. And incentive reward is dopaminergically mediated. And incentive reward occurs in relationship to advancement towards a goal, which is a form of entropy minimization, as it turns out, according to Carl Friston, who knows the thing.
Entropy is the ultimate boss battle.
Yeah. Negative emotion signifies the emergence of entropy, and positive emotion on the dopaminergic side signals its reduction. There's something that's more complex there, because the higher the goal that you're trying to attain, the more intrinsic value each step towards it comprises, and that's neuropsychologically accurate. It's part of the wisdom of the Sermon on the Mount is that if you posit the highest imaginable goal, then any step towards it that captures your attention is also deeply meaningful. And so that's an answer to what the meaning is of process, rather than say something like 42. And you said, it seems to me that you were intimating that your discovery through atoms, that the question was the thing, was key to the resolution of your existential crisis.
That's correct.
Okay, so that's part of the reason that you're motivated to say build Grok 3 and look deep.
To understand the universe.
Okay, so how old were you when you figured out that the question...
13 or something.
What did that do to you? What did that do to you?
I was a lot happier after that, because now it's okay. I'm just going to accept that we are ignorant of a great many things.
Yeah.
And we wish to be less ignorant, and anything we can do that will improve our understanding of the universe and make us less ignorant and have a deeper understanding of the universe, and even more questions to ask about the answer that is the universe, which is, I think, Adam's central point, is good. And is this a religion? I don't know. Maybe it is. But I think it's a good one. I'd call it the religion of curiosity.
Yeah. The ancient god of the Mesopotamians, his name was Marduk, and he was the best defense against ensuing chaos and state corruption. Okay, so that's how he was conceptualized. Okay, Marduk had eyes all the way around his head.
Okay.
Because he paid attention. Right, and he spoke magic words. Okay. Right, and he was literally, for the message, he was the agent that revitalized the tyrannical state and overcame evil, and also the force that dispensed with chaos and built something magnificent and cosmic out of it. Yeah.
Sounds like a force for good.
Yeah, well, the Mesopotamian emperor, so his job was to embody that spirit on earth, and they used to take him out of the city on New Year's Eve, strip him of his kingly clothing, humiliate him. They slapped him, the priests, and then they'd ask him to confess all the ways that he hadn't been a good Marduk, attentive and speaking properly in the previous year. And that's how they renewed the cosmos every year in Mesopotamia. That's our New Year celebration, is a derivation of that, out with the old and in with the new. And the Egyptians, they worship the eye, right? You've seen that famous...
The all-seeing eye of Horus?
The all-seeing eye of Horus. That's the antidote to the eye of Sauron, by the way. Because if you don't use that vision, if each citizen doesn't use that vision, it's replaced by the totalitarian all-seeing eye. That's a hell of a thing to know. You talked about delving deeper into the structure of the universe, let's say, to answer fundamental questions and you are a remarkably forward-looking person. What the hell do you think you're building with these AI systems? What is this?
I think really what all the AI companies are aiming to build is digital superintelligence. So intelligence that's far smarter than any human.
Yeah.
And ultimately an intelligence that is far smarter than all humans combined. Now one can say, is this a wise thing to do? Isn't this dangerous? Unfortunately, whether we think that or not, it is being done. But really, from my standpoint, from the XAI team standpoint, we have the choice of being a spectator or a participant.
That's life, man.
Yeah, be a spectator or a participant. And I think if we're a participant, we've got a better chance, hopefully, of steering AI in a direction that is beneficial to humanity.
So why do you trust yourself on that front? That's an important question, right?
I don't trust myself entirely.
Good. Yes. Fair enough. Okay.
Yeah.
An ethical conundrum, right?
Yes, it is an ethical conundrum.
Because you said this is happening. Now, the excuse that something is happening is not a rationale for participating in it, but then your next take is we have the chance to do this properly, let's say, as
maybe
opposed
better.
to... Okay.
I think we just, from a moral standpoint, we really just need to think that maybe we've got a chance of it being better to some degree than what others are doing. And we'll strive to avoid some of the pitfalls or directions that the others are going in. Because the others, from what I've seen, do not strive for truth.
What do they strive for?
They strive to give an answer, but they are, I think, trained to be politically correct. And the woke mind virus is woven in throughout them.
Yeah.
I'm sure you've seen that.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Definitely. My students used to ask me because I've been teaching what I've been teaching for about 40 years. And one of the questions they used to ask me is how I knew that what I was teaching wasn't just another ideology. Because the postmodern take is all it is a plethora of power games. And so there's no rank ordering approaches to the truth in terms of their ethical suitability. But that's not the game that you're playing. And
obviously would not agree with that philosophy.
Why not?
The sort of moral relativism.
What's convinced you that's not a useful way of approaching things?
I think you can look at a given belief system and critique it as being likely to enhance or decrease enlightenment. Will any given belief system improve our understanding of the universe? Will we learn more things? Will we achieve a deeper understanding of physics? And
so that's grounded, at least in part, in a scientific framework, from the sounds of it.
Well, I think there are facts about the world.
Yes, right.
There are things that are, let's say, extremely likely to be true versus less likely to be true. I think if one thinks in terms of probabilities about any given sort of axiomatic statement, then that's the right way to think about it. Now, some things are 99.99% to be true. You can run experiments, you can confirm them, and others are perhaps have a low probability of truth, 1% likely to be true, or just using extremes here. But any given statement should be thought of as having a probability of being true or untrue, a probability of being relevant to an argument or not relevant to an argument. We're just talking about the basics of cogency here.
Yeah. I didn't study science precisely. I wasn't as interested in the transformations of the material world. So I'm probably more people-oriented than thing-oriented temperamentally. So I started to study evil. Right?
Okay.
So that was my delving into the depths, because I wanted to crack that. I wanted to understand, not so much even whether it existed, because I became convinced of that very quickly, but what exactly that had to do with me. Because when I was reading history, I read it as a perpetrator and not as a victim or a hero.
I try to read history to discern the facts of what humans did,
That also has shaped the way that you act, though.
Probably, sure. I've read a lot of history. I try to understand the rise and fall of civilizations. And
what do you think makes them fall?
One of the things is a decreasing birth rate, which seems to be a natural consequence of prosperity.
Yeah, isn't that strange, eh? Because you'd predict the opposite, wouldn't you?
As far as I know, every civilization that has experienced prosperity has had a decline in population. There may be a few exceptions. Perhaps people can enlighten me. I'll look at the comments on this interview to see perhaps what I can learn. But it seems that from what I've read, almost every civilization, when they become prosperous, their birth rate drops.
I think that's a consequence of the emergence of something like a non-punished hedonistic egocentrism?
Actually, obviously, there's certainly many examples of civilizations that become prosperous. There is generally a trend towards hedonism.
Yeah, you can get away with it if you're wealthy, eh? Because the consequences of your foolishness don't smack you on the head instantly.
Precisely. If you're at a civilization under threat, let's say if you take, say, Rome, when they were trying to not get annihilated by Carthage, and they had Hannibal running around marauding Italy, they didn't have time for hedonism. Hedonism is not an option. We're going to get destroyed by Hannibal.
The chips are down.
When a civilization's under stress, there's very little hedonism that takes place.
William James said that the modern world needed a moral equivalent to war. He investigated the religious realm very deeply, and I think this was in the varieties of religious experience, and that really had an effect on me, because I think that you need something akin to an existential threat in order to set you straight.
I think there's some truth to that.
Yeah.
But if it's let's say if it's a spoiled child that that kid gets everything he or she wants, and you have a Baruch assault, and then writ large, that is a civilization that is where people get everything they want.
I think it's the right way to think about it developmentally and neuropsychologically. Okay, you had a rough childhood.
Yeah.
Yeah, like rough and tumble, rough childhood. Plenty of fights, and a father who was a
Yes.
difficult creature to contend
Difficult.
with. Okay, what did that do for you? And are you grateful for it, or are you unhappy about it?
I guess you never know the things that really made you who you are today. At the end of the day, am I on net grateful for my life? I am. And perhaps even for the hard things, because those hard things, I learned from them.
What did you learn? I read your biography.
It's not an autobiography.
No, it's not. No, definitely not.
I would tell it in a different way than Isaacson, because Isaacson, who I think is an excellent biographer, is nonetheless looking at things through his lens and wasn't there at the time.
Of course, of course. One of the things that stood out for me too, though, from that, and I would like your comments about this, was the rough details of your childhood. A lot of physical
Yes.
altercations and a lot of, I don't know exactly how to care.
Altercations. I mean, I was almost beaten to death within an inch of my life at one point.
That counts.
Yeah.
That definitely counts as
It
a
wasn't just
physical
a
relation.
few blows here and there. Yeah.
So what did that, okay. Why aren't you bitter about that? Because that's a pathway that people take.
I think that there are, one can take, and often people do take, the path of vengeance.
Yeah, that's for sure.
Yeah. Or
That's what antinatalism is.
Yeah, to feel that the world has treated them unfairly, and that they will visit upon the world that which the world has visited upon them.
And justify it by recourse to the reality of their own suffering,
Exactly.
which is often intense.
Yeah.
So the story of Job, one of the things I concluded from the story of Job, because it's a precursor to the crucifixion story. So Job makes two decisions. The first decision is that no matter how terrible things become for him, he will not lose faith in himself. And the second is, no matter what horrors are visited on him by Satan himself, he will not lose faith in the, what would you say, in the spirit that gave rise to the cosmic order. No matter what.
While I'm not a particularly religious person, I do believe that the teachings of Jesus are good and wise, and that there's tremendous wisdom in turn the other cheek. And for a while there, when I was saying, I thought that's really a weak thing to do.
It can be.
If someone, and with respect to bullies at school, I think you shouldn't turn the other cheek. You should punch them on the nose, and then thereafter make peace with them. But they need to stop bullying you, and a punch on the nose will stop that, and then thereafter make peace. So
sometimes that punch on the nose is the first step in making peace with bullies.
Yes, it may change their career from being a bully to perhaps they shouldn't be doing such things. But yeah, I think there's, anyway, I think this notion of forgiveness is important. I think it's essential, because if you don't forgive, then, as I forget who said it, but an eye for an eye makes everyone blind. If you're going to seek vengeance, and you have this never-ending cycle of vengeance.
There are anthropological speculations that we were caught in a 350,000-year cycle of not getting anywhere after modern human beings emerged, precisely because of that. Because we couldn't get out of accelerating tit-for-tat revenge cycles, right?
Yeah, so I'm actually a big believer in the principles of Christianity. I think they're very good.
So in what sense, then, are you not religious? Well, if you're harmless, you're not virtuous. You're just harmless. You're like a rabbit. A rabbit isn't virtuous. It's just can't do anything except get eaten. It's not virtuous. If you're a monster and you don't act monstrously, then you're virtuous. But you also have to be a monster. Well, you see this all the time. Harry Potter's like that too. It's like he's flawed, he's hurt, he's got evil in him. He can talk to snakes, man. He breaks rules all the time. All the time. He's not obedient at all. But, he has a good reason for breaking the rules. And if he couldn't break the rules, him and his little clique of rule-breaking, troublemakers, if they didn't break the rules, they wouldn't attain the highest goal. So it's very peculiar, but it's a very, 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 very common mythological notion. The hero has to be a monster. But a controlled monster. Batman is like that, it's everywhere. It's the story you always hear. One question is, you're kind of implicitly moral insofar as you're socialized. But that's sort of procedural. It's just built into you. This is different. This is also becoming conscious of it and expanding out your personality into dimensions that it wouldn't normally occupy. So this happens to people all the time. So, for example, lots of my clinical clients, are too agreeable. And They're generally women because women are more agreeable than men, but not always, because I've had agreeable men as clients as well. And what happens is they're resentful and they don't know how to stand up for themselves, and it's because they're very compassionate by nature. And so if you're entering into a negotiation with them, they'll let you win. Well, that's not so good, because you need to win too, especially if you're in an organization of adults where there's a struggle, right? When you have kids, you can let them win, especially infants. You have to let them win, and that's partly why compassion is so necessary. But as a basis for negotiation between adults, it's like, sorry, it's insufficient. You have to be a bit of a monster so that you can say no. And so a lot of what you do in psychotherapy is treat people's anxiety and depression. That's a huge chunk of it. Help them straighten out the way they think. That's a huge chunk of it. But another chunk of it is, well, let's toughen you up. Let's put you in a position where you can bargain. Let's teach you how to assert yourself and stand up for yourself. And that's assertiveness training. And it's a huge chunk of psychotherapy. And you need to learn it. It's like, because part of how you regulate your interactions with other people is to negotiate. And you cannot negotiate unless you can say no. You can't do it. And it causes conflict to say no, and if you don't like conflict, which is basically the definition of being agreeable, then you can't tolerate the conflict, and so then you can't negotiate on your own behalf, and so then you keep losing, and you're bullied, and it's not good. Then you get resentful, and it's really not good. So you have to develop your inner monster a little bit, and then that makes you a better person, not a worse person. It isn't so straightforward to determine what our place is in the world. And the thing that really got me with regards to that wasn't the good that we could do, but the harm that we can do. Because you can debate about the good we can do, but you cannot debate about the harm we can do. That's done. We know, if we want to know. And I think my experience was when I took that seriously, which meant understanding how that was about me, about there's a city, and the city is full of people who are sinful. What does that mean? Well, to sin is an archery term. It means to miss the mark. So these are people who aren't oriented properly. And so the city is in a chaotic state. And God tells Jonah that he's going to go to that city and tell them just exactly what's up with them. And Jonah thinks, no, I'm not going to do that. And why? Well, that doesn't require much explanation. It's like, how popular are you going to be if you go to a city full of chaotic people and tell them why they're stupid and wrong? Jonah thinks, no, I'm not going to do that. I don't care if God's telling me to do it. So his conscience is telling him to do it, or his destiny is telling him to do it, or his orientation with higher morality is telling him to do it. You can read it any way you want. And so he thinks, no, I'm hopping on this boat and I'm getting as far away from that city as I possibly can. And so he does that, and then the storm comes up because God thinks, no, you're not getting away. If I told you to do something, you're not getting away from it. A storm comes up. Well, what does that mean? Well, it's easy. Betray your destiny and see how long it takes you to be drowning in a storm. It'll happen immediately, and of course it will, because what's calling you to be your best is exactly the thing that's pushing you forward to manifest yourself most fully in the world. It's what you need. You run away from that, the boat's going to start to rock very, very quickly. Well, you all know that. You know that perfectly well. It's hell, all you have to do is not study for an exam that you know that's coming up to see everything the storm waters start to rise and everything start to rock. It's pretty bloody obvious. So anyways, he's on this boat and there's a storm, and all of the people on the boat who can't quite discriminate chaos from weather because they haven't differentiated the world to that degree, think, oh, the boat wouldn't be about to be swamped if some of us hadn't done something stupid and wrong. And there's logic in that. You might think, well, God has nothing personal against you because of the storm, so you're confusing levels of analysis. But you got to give these people some credit. It's like, maybe they did do something stupid. Maybe they didn't caulk the damn boat properly. Maybe the ropes aren't in as good a shape as they might be. Maybe they weren't paying attention to the weather when they went out on the ocean, Or maybe they haven't made peace with their brother, and so their hearts are bent, twisted out of shape, so they don't make particularly good sailors.
It's like the idea that you encounter a storm because you're stupid and wrong is a really good idea, even though it's not of infinite applicability. Anyways, they draw lots. It's a primitive thing to do. It's like, well, it's someone's fault. We don't know who. We're going to throw someone overboard, the worst sinner. Obviously, that's what God wants, some kind of sacrifice. So they all draw lots and someone loses. And then Jonah stands up and says, well, sorry guys, like I know that I've got a problem with God at the moment, so it's probably me. You better throw me over. And they don't really want to, but he finally convinces them. Over he goes. And the storm settles. Well, you know, sometimes if you're in a group of people in an organization, there is someone in the organization whose head isn't screwed on exactly straight. And they know exactly why it is and what they've done wrong and what puts them in that position. And they are poisoning the entire enterprise. And if you throw them overboard, or better, if they agree voluntarily to leave, then the storm will abate and everything will be okay. So anyways, they throw Jonah overboard, and a whale comes up and swallows him and takes him down to the bottom of the ocean. Well, we already know what that means because we watched Pinocchio. It's like when God abandons you because you've abandoned your destiny, and the storms come up, the probability that you're going to be taken down to the depths is extraordinarily high, and that happens in people's lives all the time. Well, so down there, Jonah repents. Well, what do you do when you're in the underworld? Well, you've been there before when things fall apart on you. Your friends have abandoned you. You're not as popular as you could be. You can't stand to look at yourself in the mirror. Into the underworld you go, and you think, geez, I've done a lot of things wrong. You know, maybe I should reconcile myself with the world and I could get out of this. Well, so that's what Jonah does. He thinks, all right, I've got this destiny. I better go do what God says. So the whale spits him out onto the beach, and off he goes to the city to tell them what's wrong. Well, that's what that represents. That's these symbols, you know. It's so cool. This second one, I really like. It's so interesting because you see Jonah re-emerging from the whale, and he's got a halo around his head. You say, well, what's a halo? Well, have you ever looked at a quarter? Well, think about a quarter. A quarter's the moon. And who's on the quarter? The queen. The queen is surrounded by the halo of the moon. The queen's queen of the night. Gold coin, that's the king's head on the sun. That's the halo. Well, what comes out of the belly of the fish? It's the illuminated human being. It's the spirit of the illuminated human being. Well, that's what that means. Well, what does that mean? Well, what else would come out of chaos? You know, if you fall apart and then you put yourself back together, what is it that comes back out? Well, at least you're in better shape than you were before, you know, and then maybe you do that 20 times in your life or 50 times, and you do it voluntarily. Every time you do it, you're more like the thing with the halo and less like the thing that's, you know, being thrown overboard by your friends.
One of the things that I've realized is that people that are self-reflective, that rely on cerebral horsepower, that pay attention, that think in a detailed way, the more nuanced that your thinking is, the fewer people are going to be like you, which makes you feel more alone. How do you think people can overcome this?
Well, I would say that hasn't been my experience exactly. Because as I started to make my thoughts more public, they seem to appeal to more and more people. And so I don't know if that's a threshold phenomena, because maybe it is, you know. As you start to become specialized as a scientist, in some sense your vision narrows and narrows, although it gets more high resolution at the level that you're operating. But you kind of pass through a needle, let's say, out the other side where the thing you're studying starts to become everything again. And so maybe that's that developmental progression.
Further, more.
Yeah, specialization and then
generalization again. Yeah, I think that you might be right there. The deeper into the breach thing, the show that I went to go and see you do in Manchester in 2017 or 18, someone asked a question about the depth of my consciousness causes me to suffer, and you said you take more of the thing that poisons you until you turn it into a tonic that girdles the world around you. And I think that this is something you see here as well, that when you start to think differently, when you start to consider the way that you're living your life in a more detailed, higher resolution, more unique, more nuanced way, you will probably receive pushback, especially, speaking from personal experience, in normal working class towns, people born, live, die in these places. It's insular. There isn't a huge culture of, especially in the UK, tall poppy syndrome is a huge problem. The biggest difference that I've noticed actually between American people and English people is that American children are told that they can be anything that they want to be. They're told that they have blue sky vision, they can achieve whatever they want. And that gives them a lot of confidence. When us Brits, stuffy, stiff upper lip Brits see Americans on TV, it sounds like everyone's had media training. Because everybody's just so enthused about whatever it is, even if it's a 18-car pileup. And then the equivalent in the UK is that deviating from the norm is very, very, very quickly mocked. And
there's a lot of that in Canada too.
Tall poppy syndrome, it's a big deal. Now,
the Japanese have that saying too, except it's the nail that sticks up above all the rest is the first one to be struck down by the hammer. And there's some truth in that too. There's some truth in that, but some and all are very different words.
When you roll the clock forward, what you end up with is American children that then become adults who look around at the world and say, well, hang on, this wasn't what I was promised. I was told that I could be anything that I wanted to be. I was told that I could have anything that I wanted to have.
There's a difference between you can earn everything that is earnable and you deserve everything there is. So that message can become what you say, it can become misinterpreted in a narcissistic manner. And I think that has happened to some degree, especially as people have had fewer and fewer children. Jonathan Haidt and Luke Yanoff talk about the coddling of the American mind, and they think about that in large part as a consequence of an ideological transformation. And some of that's true, but it's also useful to look at more fundamental phenomena. People have children when they're a lot older. They have way fewer children. They have way more resources when they have children on average. If you're one kid of 8, you're pretty much battling it out for attention, for a very finite amount of parental attention with a lot of intense competition. And the probability that you're going to come out of that entitled and narcissistic is pretty damn low, because your siblings will definitely punish you for that. But if you're the only child, especially of older parents who are also more conservative because of their age and also less willing to take chances with you because there's only one of you, and then you have a lot of resources at your disposal, well, that's a whole different developmental milieu. And we have no idea what the consequences of that are. But the idea that children in that circumstance are more likely to be overprotected and dependent and structured, it's like, well, yeah, undoubtedly. And, that would even be an overabundance of parental virtue in some sense, right? Well, we just did nothing but pay attention to our child. Okay, but too much.
What did you expect?
Yeah.
It's so strange because I'm an only child, right? And all of maybe my friends might say differently, but a lot of the commonly held presumptions around only children, I have a couple of friends who are as well, and I don't know whether it's where we're from, that the northeast of the UK is very spit and sawdust, it's salt of the earth people, it's, grab your bootstraps and your boots and start pulling. And I just haven't seen that. What is it through your clinical practice?
This might not be a primarily working class phenomena, the coddled mind phenomena. That could easily be a middle class and upper phenomena.
Is there something, was there a common trend, or from your reading, have you found that only children tend to be one way or another?
No.
So you just get huge variance in them as well?
I don't know the answer to that at the level of individual psychological data. There might be a literature. I'm not aware of it. That, for me, that was more a response to Haidt's book on the coddled mind. I thought, okay, fair enough. Coddling of the American mind. What's driving this? It's not just ideas. It's a huge demographic switch. It's a huge transformation in the way we raise children. We're 10 years older when we have our children now. That's a lot older. When you're 18 and you have a kid, you're still a kid. And that there's some wildness that's perhaps not so good about that. But there's also perhaps a higher proclivity to go off and live your own life. And then, how much should your children be left on their own? The answer is as much as they can tolerate. And how much is that? Well, you find out with each child. But it's certainly possible to not deprive your child enough.
What's happening, people? If you enjoyed that, then press here for the full, unedited episode. And don't forget to subscribe. Peace.